to just hold it. All right, good evening, everyone. I have to hold it closer? Okay. I shall say it in Hebrew. Erev Tov. And where are our Israeli guests? There they are. Bruchot habaot. Welcome in Hebrew. I want you to know that my only claim to fame today is that I'm a friend of Dr. Ralph Folman, or as we call him, Rafi, and he's going to speak to us. But I also wanted to welcome you to our temple, to Holy Blossom Temple. I'm a member, a very long-standing member, and I'm just so pleased to see you here. I know we have quite a lot of people on Zoom. So this is our Mishkan, our sanctuary. It's a smaller sanctuary, and we hope that you will have a very good evening. I would like to introduce you to Ronit Lustig, who is the executive director. What? Sorry?
No, director of partnership and.
Can you say it?
I'll explain. Not yet the executive director. Hi, everyone. Frida, your phone. Hi, everyone. Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us tonight, here and at home. My name is Ronit. I work at the Ghetto Fighters House Museum in Israel, located between Akko and Nahariya in the northern part of Israel. You can see a nice photo of the place up there. And I'm in charge of development and partnerships, but also run some of the educational programming. I'm delighted to be here tonight and delighted to introduce you to two colleagues. One of them is Professor Hannah Yablonka. She's a professor of modern Jewish history at Ben Gurion University in the Negev, and the museum's chief historian for the past 23 years. It's a great pleasure to have Hannah here with us, and she will be giving the major and the keynote speaker of tonight's event. And the other colleague, who is more of a friend than a colleague, is Dr. Ralph Folman, who is strongly connected. He's local, he's from here. You probably know him, but might have not heard his story. And he's connected to the museum in a very special way, which you'll hear about very soon. The museum, I'm not sure if I mentioned, it's the world's first Holocaust museum, which was established in 1949 by Holocaust survivors. Some of them were survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, who came, you can see up there the day they new home, the kibbutz Lochamei HaGheta'ot, Ghetto Fighters Kibbutz, and at the same day established an archive and a museum, back then in 1949. At the bottom you see some pieces of the museum today. One of the founders of the museum was Antek Yitzhak Zuckerman. When they came and established their home, they said that their mission is to tell the story of the Holocaust and focus on several themes. One of them is the spirit of the triumph of the human spirit. And as you can see here, Antek Zuckerman said, if the uprising, which we're commemorating today, at the 80th anniversary of the uprising, he said that this topic should not be taught at military school. It's not about the tactics, it's not about the operation, it's not about the weapon, about the preparation for the uprising, it's about the human spirit. And if there is a school to teach the human spirit, this should be taught there, and we feel and hope that our museum is a school of that kind. And here we can see, just so you know what our main goals are, to talk about the Holocaust while emphasizing the triumph of human spirit, resistance in all its forms, broadening the concept and idea of resistance and human choice. This is what we focus on, and this is how what we share with our visitors and with the audience that we meet. You're all sitting here, so I'm kind of moving back and forth. This is how we look from the bird's eye view. We can see here the main building. At the left, at the bottom right, we see a children's museum. In between, there's a huge open-air theater where the annual assembly for Holocaust Remembrance Day in Israel takes place, the formal closing assembly. And behind the main building, we have a Center for Humanistic Education. If you haven't been, and even if you have, we're welcome all of you to come and enjoy this beautiful campus that some people say is a kind of a hidden gem. So we're here and we're pleased to be here, but it's not the first time that the Ghetto Fighters House came to visit Toronto. As you can see here, Yitzhak Zuckerman, whose quote we saw earlier, was here in 1952. He's sitting third from right, was very tall, and you can see it even when he's sitting. And on the right-hand side, we see 1960. His wife, Tzivia Lubetkin, both were leaders at the Ghetto youth movement in the Warsaw Ghetto, leaders of the Uprising, and later founders of the museum. She visited Toronto in 1960. Later, in 1963, a delegation from Toronto came to the museum and brought this book, Sefer Zikaron, telling the story, handwritten and hand-illustrated from your community. It's in our archive today, the story of different communities, Lvov, Warsaw, Vilna, and Lodz. All the stories of these 4 communities are, again, handwritten in the book. Once you visit, I promise to take out the book and show you. It's in Yiddish, mostly. Okay, so actually you can see here on the left-hand side, Antek Zuckerman pointing at a model of Treblinka extermination camp, which is the centerpiece of one of our galleries, the Hall of Camps. And when I said earlier that we focus on the triumph of human spirit and resistance and human choice, even when we talk about the camps, these themes lead the interpretation and the mediation of the story. So the Hall of Camps is at the bottom of the museum. 1 floor up, we have an interesting gallery. When you enter that gallery, the hall is completely dark. And what you see on the wall is an interesting installation of letters. Everything's dark. It's hard to imagine here, but all you see is those letters. And this hall is called Izkor. We call it Izkor to commemorate, because the questions that are discussed there relate to commemoration. Is it possible? How can we do it? Who should do it? Why it's important? And what you see here are letters that rise up, form names of 4,600 communities, Jewish communities that were destroyed in the Holocaust. And what's interesting about it is that it takes a long time, 1.5 minutes, for the name to be formed, like for a community to be built, and 2 seconds for the name to be rising back up. And in many cases, we try to convey the idea that a community was destroyed, that was built in hundreds of years, was destroyed in days or weeks. And then we ask how we can remember that community that was destroyed. And the rest of the gallery, the rest of the walls of that gallery provide an answer and a key to an answer. They hide a treasure behind them, which is our collection and our archive. You would go to one of the walls, press on it, and then a set of objects will be revealed to you. And now I'm going to show you 2 objects that relate directly to our story, and then give the stage to Ralph and then to Professor Jablonka. But you get the idea that this is, I think, a different museum if it has a gallery with no texts in it, just something that makes you feel the pain of loss and and darkness, and then at the same time gives you an answer to how to commemorate. And the answer is this drawer. You would go, you press a button, you shine light on the drawer and on the objects, you learn about them, and then you can take your understanding and your interpretation and share it with the world. By doing that, you create memory, you do an act, you perform an act of commemoration. It's on you, it's your responsibility. That's what we explain. And by being here today, here and at home on Zoom, I feel like we're also taking an active stance towards commemoration. On the right-hand side, we see a suitcase. It's one of the objects that our drawers show once you shine light. And also another aspect is that creating memory means bringing light to that full darkness. Okay, museum people like to talk with symbols, and once you're there, it's easier to understand. So this suitcase belonged to a courier. Have you heard about the young female couriers between the ghettos? It's a lesser known story and a very brave and important one. I think Hannah will talk, Professor Jablonka will talk about it later with Chavka's story, no? So young girls, and we can imagine why girls and not boys, had to move between the ghettos and bring information and newspapers and fake IDs, money, weapon. They risked their lives and they took on a fake identity, and it was harder to tell that they're Jewish, the same, I mean, if we compare to boys. So it was a women's job, and again, they served like a lifeline between the ghettos. They crossed borders and ghettos, went in and out, and they were called the couriers, or in Hebrew, kashariyot. From the word kesher, means connection. They really created connections of life. One of those couriers, and now we're getting to our story today, was Chavka. Chavka Fullman was a courier that lived with a fake Polish identity. She was caught and sent to Auschwitz as a Christian Pole, Emma Marciniak, a woman named Emma Marciniak, not Chavka and not Chava. When she was there, she was, as a Pole, she was able to receive packages from her mother, who also lived under fake identity. And once her mother wrote to her, she signaled somehow that there is something hidden in one of the items in the box that she's sending her. Okay, you follow me? We're talking about Chavka, the courier, who used some kind of these suitcases. This belonged to someone else, but still the story. She was caught, sent to Auschwitz, and there in Auschwitz, she received a package. Looking at the different items, she found the hidden pocket, and there she found a photo. And this is what she writes in her testimony, a photo of Rafi, my nephew, my baby nephew. It was something from a different planet, something so distant, so lost for me. And this Rafi, this baby nephew, is here tonight with us, this Dr. Fullman. So we will soon hear a little bit about him and relations to Chavka. The other object that I wanted to show you is a Medal of Honor that was given to Wolf Fullman, Chavka's brother, Vivek, who was part of the Polish underground and was killed in a battle with the Germans. His son Vivek Wolf is Rafi's father. So we now heard about his father and aunt, and the third brother also received a Medal of Honor, fought in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and then later killed by trying to get to another ghetto. The full story of them will be told by Ralph. We see here the mother, Shoshana, and the three children, Vivek, which is Wolf, which is Rafi's father, Marek, and Chavka. I'd like to invite Ralph to talk about your family and the story of these people whose objects we just saw how they're presented at the museum. But before that, I'll mention, and earlier mentioned, that we have an annual ceremony. This year, we had, this is how our annual assembly looks like. And this year, we were honored to have Ralph Fullman, who sits here, the son of Vivek, the nephew of Chavka, light one of the torches. Here you can see him on the left-hand side. And on the right, we see Chavka, who survived and established the museum. She was among the founders of the kibbutz and the museum, speaking in one of the assemblies. I'll show you a quick video that was presented during the assembly, and then I'll call Ralph to come and share your story.
רפאל פולמן הוא בנם של וולף ורבקה.
נולדתי בגטו ורשה ב-1 לספטמבר 1941. הוריי לא רק שרצו ילד, אבל גם כן...
Sorry, I wanted it on full screen. So sorry.
ללדת תינוק זה היה אות של ומעשה של
וולף ורבקה. וולף, אביו של רפאל, ומרק דודו, שניהם חברי הארגון היהודי הלוחם, נפלו בקרבות עם הגרמנים. חבקה, דודתו, שהייתה קשרית בארגון, נתפסה במהלך פעילות של המחתרת בקרקוב.
Sorry, just a minute.
רפאל פולמן הוא בנם של וולף ורבקה.
נולדתי בגטו ורשה ב-1 לספטמבר 1941. הוריי לא רק שרצו ילד, אבל גם כן ללדת תינוק זה היה אות של ומעשה של מרד נגד הפולשים גרמנים.
וולף, אביו של רפאל, ומרק דודו, שניהם חברי הארגון היהודי הלוחם, נפלו בקרבות עם הגרמנים. חבקה, דודתו, שהייתה קשרית בארגון, נתפסה במהלך פעילות של המחתרת בקרקוב ונאסרה באושוויץ. חבריה דאגו להבריח את רפאל ואימו מחוץ לגטו, והם חיו בזהות בדויה.
הזיכרונות הראשונים שיש לי בתור ילד קטן, ואני חושב שהייתי בן שנתיים וחצי, הוא שאני ואני יושבים על מדרגות לפני הבית שבו גרנו בצד הארי של ורשה, ופתאום הרחוב מתמלא בחיילים גרמניים. אני שואל את אמי, מה הם עושים כאן? והיא עונה לי, הם מחפשים את אבא שלך.
לאחר השחרור הועברו רפאל ואימו לגרמניה. השניים עלו ארצה, ורפאל נקלט בחברת הילדים של קיבוץ יגור. הקיבוץ היה מקום מושבו של אחד מגרעיני המייסדים של קיבוץ לוחמי הגטאות.
חבקה בינתיים, היא אחרי השחרור, היא נשארה באירופה לכמה זמן, אולי שנה, לעזור ליהודים לעלות לארץ. ואז היא גם באה ליגור, והטיפול בי עבר מאנטגבסיביה אליה.
אמו של רפאל נישאה בשנית. בראשית שנות ה-50 היגרו בני המשפחה לקנדה.
בקנדה עשיתי השתלמות לרפואת ילדים. אנחנו גידלנו שתי בנות, אריאלה ורונית, וגם יש עכשיו נכד, שמו בנימין, גם ידוע בתור בנג'י.
חבקה, דודתו של רפאל, נישאה ליחזקאל רבן, והשניים היו ממייסדי קיבוץ לוחמי הגטאות. חבקה הייתה מחנכת ואשת עדות. היא נפטרה בשנת 2014. קריאתה לדורות הצעירים להמשיך ולהיאבק למען חברה שוויונית וחומלת היא מופת לכולנו. רפאל פולמן הוא בנם של וולף ורבקה.
נולדתי בגטו ורשה בראשון.
Okay. Ralph Fullman is, Rafi Fullman is also the president of what will become the Canadian Friends of the Ghetto Fighters House. Now you understand why and how it's connected to us. And thank you for arranging this and for connecting us to Frida and making this happen. Our goal today is twofold. One is to introduce you to the museum, what I try to do. Hopefully you have a better sense of the museum, and invite you to join the Canadian Friends, a group that we're hoping to form that will be in touch with us in different ways, either in person or through virtual means. And the other is join us in commemorating the 80th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And that would be the part of the lecture, the talk. So now I would like to invite Rafi to come, and we'll have this photo up and share information about your family and connection.
Thank you. And how many minutes do I have? כמה זמן יש לי? Okay, so first of all, I have to clarify why I have two names. Rafael, Rafi. Rafi is a very common nickname for Rafael in Hebrew, and Ralph. And that came about because when I was brought to Canada at the age of 12, I quickly discovered that the locals were historically and linguistically and biblically challenged. So in spite of me having a name like one of the archangels, I suppose, and also the famous Renaissance painter, they just couldn't pronounce Raphael properly. So after having all kinds of permutations of that name, I one day decided to ask the teacher to call me Ralph. The teachers were very relieved. So this is why I have these two names, and on my passport I'm in Ottawa, I'm Raphael, but my Ontario driver's license is Ralph. My story was basically already told here. I grew up, my connection was that I grew up in Yagur, which is a big kibbutz, very close to Haifa. And that's where the nucleus of the Ghetto Fighters kibbutz was established by the survivors of the Uprising. But my mother, she was from I would say a bourgeois Jewish family in Poland. From what I'm told, my grandfather owned a metals factory in a small city called Radomsko. So they were well off, and she basically was raised as slightly higher than the middle class, and she couldn't get used to the kibbutz life. So she left me to be taken care of by Antek and Sivia, because they were sort of very well acquainted and friends from the resistance. So that's how I'm connected with them. And then Chavka, my aunt, as was told on the video, she came from Europe, and then my foster parentage was transferred to her. So I actually I had one grandparent left after the Shoah, but I had 3 sets of parents. So I guess I was lucky from that point of view. And I grew up with that nucleus of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising survivors. I even was on the trucks that brought them to their to the abandoned Arab village, which was given to them by the government, and which was actually also a British army post. And now it's the base for the Golani Brigade, which is a famous brigade in charge of security in the north of Italy, of Israel. So that's basically my story. How I ended up in Canada, that's another sort of sad story.
Where you were born.
Yeah, well, yes, so.
And about the family members. I didn't talk about your father too much.
Okay. So actually I can stand here and talk for a few hours, but I have to condense it. Otherwise you'll all fall asleep. So as mentioned, I was born in the ghetto. Both my father and my aunt and my uncle were, and my grandmother were members of the, were active in the Jewish resistance and also the Polish resistance. And actually there were two sets of Polish resistance, the right-wing one, which was connected to the Polish government in exile in London, and the more socialist resistance. My family was with the socialists. And so we were smuggled, my mother and I were smuggled out of the ghetto. My father was actually, professionally, he was an architect, so he knew how to sketch and draw, which a talent that I did not inherit at all. And he was in charge of producing false IDs for the resistance. So we were smuggled and we lived in the Aryan side as Poles until the end of the war. At a certain point in time, my father decided that producing false IDs was not enough. He really felt that he needed to have a rifle and actually shoot at the Nazis, at the Germans. And so he escaped into the forest around Warsaw, but within a couple of weeks, his unit was betrayed by a Polish peasant, and they were surrounded by German soldiers, and they had to fight their way out, and he was killed. And his brother was a very active member of the Jewish resistance, an educator, and he was also traveling. He got killed because he was traveling between ghettos, and he was one day in a train station, he was caught and put against the wall and shot. So Chavka was the only one who survived, passing herself off as a Pole. And then when Auschwitz was liberated, there was a famous train organized by the Swedes, by the Swedish government, to take the women of Auschwitz, the one who survived, to take them to Sweden. And she was one of those women, and they arrived in Sweden, and they were all sort of farmed out to different families to work as caregivers for the children and servants. And then one day, somehow, I've never found out how, an article in the newspapers was published, and her story, her story and the story of my father and my uncle became public, and from a servant, she was elevated to a princess. So, and funny enough, some years ago, I was in China, in Shanghai, and in Shanghai there was a small ghetto created by the Japanese, and there is a building there that was served as the synagogue of that ghetto. And I was taken to this. I asked my Chinese how do you call it? A Chinese girl who was showing me around Shanghai. I asked her to take me to this ghetto, and I went to the second floor, and there was a picture of my aunt, the same picture that you saw here with the Auschwitz uniform of a prisoner. And after, when the war ended, of course, Stalin dropped the Iron Curtain in Europe. And my mother and I somehow smuggled out over mountains and through forests from Poland to Germany, and we ended up in Munich, in München, which was then the headquarters of the United Nations Refugee Agency, which supplied people with housing and even allowed them to enroll in higher education and universities. So my mother enrolled in, how many more minutes do I have? Enrolled in the medical school, and I was put into a German kindergarten, and I'm told that within 6 months, I spoke perfect Bavarian, German with a Bavarian accent, which I almost completely forgot. And then one night, a couple of guys showed up at our house apartment, and they said, we are from the Haganah, we are taking you to Palestine, or Eretz Israel. And that's how I ended up in Israel. We ended up in Israel, and I grew up there to the age of 12. And then my parents, and this was 1952, so if you know some of the history of Israel, it was a very tough time. The borders were the 1948 borders. There were Arab terrorist attacks constantly on the roads and schools. And my parents being both, my mother remarried. She also married a Holocaust survivor, Polish survivor. So they were terrified that there would be another Holocaust. And at that time, it looked like it. I mean, that Israel was surrounded by 7 Arab armies that were supplied and trained by the British. So they were terrified that the whole history of the Holocaust will repeat itself. And my mother found a relative in Canada who had escaped to Russia during when the Germans invaded Poland, and he came to Canada straight from Russia, and she found, and he was our sponsor to come to Canada. But my parents told me that we are leaving for Canada 1 week before we left. They probably figured that if they tell me a little earlier, I would probably run away to the kibbutz, which I probably would have done. And that's how I ended up in Canada, and I finished schooling here, medical school in Toronto, and then, but I always wanted to go back to Israel, which I did with a young wife, now ex-wife, who was sitting there in the audience. And in 1970, we came to Israel after about a year or so of working in some hospitals as a medical resident. I was given the choice of either leaving immediately, because I had a period of 1 year's grace as a returning citizen. I was a returning citizen, okay? Or I had to do some army service. I could have become a civilian working for the army as a doctor in, let's say, some underserviced area in Israel, or actually enlist in the army. And I thought to myself, well, if you're going to do it, might as well go all the way. So I enlisted in the Army, and I was in the medical doctor, frontline officer and for about a year and a half, both in the mainly in the armored corps. And then I promised my wife at that time that we'll go back to Canada if she still wants to. So we came back, and that's where I ended up becoming a pediatrician. And one of my teachers, Dr. Keith Meloff, who's sitting there, trying not to look too bored, he was one of my teachers at the Hospital for Sick Children. So that's my connection with this congregation. Just to finish, Frida and her children and family became our friends through their children, because my two daughters and her two sons went to Montessori together. So that's my story. Thank you.
Anyone has any question to Ralph? Thank you so much. Wait, let's see if there are any questions. Anyone would like to ask?
It's overwhelming, this story.
Was he the best student in your class?
Thank you. Ralph? If you went back to Warsaw, the question is...
I did go back once because my aunt, after people kept asking her to do so, she wrote a book. It's not a big book, it's a small book. It's called, the English translation is They Are Still With Me, and it's possible to purchase it, I think, through Amazon or... Anyway, she wrote a book about her life, both before the war and after, during and after. And when I finished reading the book, I felt I really was obligated, needed to go back to Warsaw to look up my roots. And at that time, I had an uncle on my mother's side, not the former, the Shapiro side, who was also a historian, and he stayed in Poland after the war. He was very careful to become an expert in communist history only until 1914. If he had been a little, if he had tried to be to delve into history after that, he would probably have been purged in one of the Stalinist purges. So when I visited Warsaw, he actually was the director of the Jewish Polish Historical Museum in Poland itself, in Warsaw itself. And he showed me around where we lived. So I was there for a week, and that was quite enough for me. I've never been back.
Thank you. Did you want to ask? A quick question and answer. Yes. Sorry? Yeah, so we would, that's a topic for another meeting, the story of Shanghai. Okay, if you have any question.
Sorry, I just, how I was there when I had a significant other who worked as a teacher, an English teacher in China. And so I visited, I was there for about 3 weeks. And one of the places that I visited was Shanghai. And then that's where I found my aunt's photograph.
Thank you.
And the guy who showed me around, I said, that's my aunt. She didn't believe me.
Thank you so much for sharing emotions and stories. I'm delighted to invite you now to exciting historical exploration by Professor Hannah Jablonka, who will deepen our understanding of the uprising and its lasting, ongoing impact. Thank you, Hannah. The stage is yours.
No, I speak something. Is that okay? No, אני לא זה. אני צריכה את הידיים. works. It works. Yeah. Absolutely works. Wow. Good evening, everybody. Unlike my name, which is through to my marriage, I'm not Polish. And I heard that there is a Hungarian section over there. I rather belong to that section. I speak Hungarian. But we are speaking tonight about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And I thought, how is the best way to represent to you this event? And I thought the best way to introduce you to this event is to try and crack down what is the essence of this event. Now, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is not the Battle of England. It's not Dunkirk. It's not Iwo Jima. It's a very small event. Actually, we are speaking about 800 soldiers or fighters that fought in the ghetto against the German army. But when we speak of it, and when we think how great a place it captures in our notions of Second World War or the Jewish conduct during Second World War, we have to consider that this event is something else. This event is basically a struggle, and I'm saying something very general, which I, of course, will elaborate over my speech. It's a struggle to maintain human dignity. And this sounds like a cliche, I know, but we will try and see what is human dignity and what did they try to protect. And when I say this, we speak here about an event that is really one of the great exemplary of human spirit in the history of Second World War and the Jewish Shoah in particular. I would like also to say something in advance. Most of the pictures that we saw of Chavka do her injustice. She was, besides everything else, she was a beautiful woman. She had the most beautiful blue eyes, and I'm telling this first because she had beautiful blue eyes, but her blue eyes actually made her the perfect emissary, giving information from one ghetto to the other, because such blue eyes usually are attributed to non-Jews. I will start my lecture, as you see, Ghetto, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Myth, Reality, Memory, and Legacy. I will start with a few facts. I always teach my students that you cannot give a text without a context if you really want to understand the text correctly or accurately. So the few informations that I want to give you is something about the timeline of what happened to the Jews, so we can put in an adequate place when and why the uprising started, when it started, and how it started. So the first date that I want to give you is probably the most known dates to all of you, and that's the invasion to Poland on September 1st, 1939, 2 years before Rafi was born. And that's the beginning of Second World War, and that's the beginning of the turning of the fate of the Jews in Poland. The next event I want to mention to you is the establishment of the Warsaw Ghetto, which did not happen at the beginning of the war. It happened on the 2nd of October in 1940. That means it was closed in April of 1940. It was closed in 1940 in October. And so that we have at least 2 years before the Jews were transported into Treblinka. That we can imagine that some kind of normal life was taking place there, or at least life without the thinking that we are going all to be at the end dead. What is most important in this timeline is the third part of my lecture, of the timeline, is the Nazi decision on the final solution. Usually, people believe that the Nazi decision was taken in the Wannsee Conference, which is of course not true, because when the Wannsee Conference was convened in January of 1942, there were already 1.5 million Russian Jews dead. So the final solution took place while preparing the invasion of the Germans to Russia. That is March of 1941. The solution to kill the Jews, the final solution, was accepted. We don't know exactly, it was calculated. We think there are researchers who think today that it was accepted in 2 parts. The first one was the killing of the Eastern European Jews, and then in the autumn of 1941, the decision to kill also the Western European Jews. But March 41 is the beginning of the concept of the final solution. Now, the beginning of deportations from the Warsaw Ghetto, which actually ended up with the beginning of what we call the Uprising, is July 1942. So you can see from October 1940 until July 1942, there was no deportations. People lived in the ghetto. About 500,000 Polish Jews were living in the ghetto. I don't know if any of us would call that life, but they were living in the ghetto without nobody killing them. Some of them, quite a few, died of hunger because there was not enough food. But there was no final solution and no transportations from Warsaw. On September 21st, the transportation went on from July 23rd of 1941 until September 21st of 1942. Not 49, 49, that's Israel. It's about 3 months, and within these 3 months, 300,000 of the Jews of Warsaw Ghetto were perished. Because in Treblinka, it's not a regular camp, it's only an extermination camp. We should differentiate between the 2 kinds of camps. Now, Adam Cherniakov, who was the head of the Judenrat at the ghetto, at the Warsaw Ghetto before the uprising, took his own life when he was asked to give the first transport into the Germans. He killed himself, and that was July 23rd. And that actually created in the ghetto a leadership vacuum. There was no leadership in the ghetto. And to this vacuum, the organization, the Jewish Fighters Organization, came in and claimed leadership. So they claimed leadership in the ghetto only after Cherniakov took his life and the ghetto was vacuumed of leadership. This is very important to remember. They didn't claim leadership before that. There were not opposition to the leadership of the Judenrat. They claimed leadership only when there was no leaders after Cherniakov killed himself. The last thing is that in January of 1943, at the beginning of 1943, there were only about 60 to 70,000 Jews left in the ghetto. And the first uprising was the small uprising in January of 43. And they made the Germans escape the ghetto for 1 day. And with that feeling that they succeeded in making the Germans escape the ghetto, they went to the big uprising in April of 1943. I want to say something important about this. There was no uprising or any clandestine activity before the Jews actually were convinced that they are sentenced to death, all of them. It wasn't the German occupation which caused them to an uprising. It was the notion, which is really very astonishing how they got it, and I'm going to speak about that. It was the notion we are all going to die, we are doomed to die, somebody decided to kill us all, which caused the uprising. Now we will go and try and crack this event. Usually, when 2 nations are in war, or when there is a kind of a cleansing, what we call today genocide, by the way, a term termed only in 1943 during Second World War. There was no term to mention what happened to the Armenians, for instance, in the First World War. When a genocide is happening, there are always some pragmatical reason which causes it, like ethnic hatred, like a dispute over territories, like a religious dispute. This element is completely lacking in the persecution of the Jews. No pragmatic reason why the Germans should kill the Jews. They were good slaves during Second World War. Nevertheless, they killed them. They lost good slaves out of no reason. You cannot understand in the repertoire that we have our reasoning why the Germans did kill the Jews for pragmatic reasons. Ideologically, yes, any kind of heritage, but that doesn't count for the fact that within 60 million Jews, between 16 million Jews, only 400,000 Jews lived in Germany. That's not even a minority. So we have to bear this in mind when I want to tell you what was the essence of the enemy the Jews were fighting in the uprising. We have a very good definition of the nature of the enemy. I forgot to, sorry. By a philosopher by the name of Emil Fackenheim. Emil Fackenheim is... Oh, really? Okay, so you probably know that he actually defined the role of the Shoah in the modern era. This is very important saying of his, that it's an epoch-changing event. And I completely adopted this definition. But anyway, Emil Fackenheim described and defined the nature of the enemy. The counter-society, he called it. It is modern, as it is highly technological. It's a counter, as it is aimed at death. Even the most left-behind social group is aiming at life. Usually we aim at life. The kingdom of the Shoah was aiming at death. The only purpose of the kingdom of the Shoah was itself, as it had only the final product, death. The extermination of the Jews is the extreme example of a counter society. Before I go on, so we know that the essence of the enemy was nothing building up, nothing fertile, nothing constructive. It had only one reason to live against the Jews, and that's the concept and the activism of death. Before I go on, I need also to speak one word about leadership, because in a minute I'll show you the greatness of these young people which caused the uprising. Leadership is one of the most investigated terms in sociology. However, I will not give you all the analytical stuff about that, but I want to say that in a component, in the basic situation of leadership, it is composed of 4 elements: the leader, the group, the situation, and the mission. So, the mission, and I say mission, and it's also the decision. What is a good leader? We know that only in retrospect, that somebody was a good leader. But in retrospect, we judge how did he interpret the situation he's in, what were the options he considered, what is the definition of what is needed to do with these options, which options do I choose, and of course the final decision. The situation during the Holocaust was a situation that nobody could interpret, because the final solution was a secret, because the final solution to wipe up the whole people from the face of the earth was something novel. It did not happen before. Nobody knew it in the repertoire, in the human repertoire. So, and it was a crisis condition for the Jews. So understanding the situation is really unexpected from anybody. And you will see in a moment how these young people interpreted the situation in a completely unprecedented event. Now, when I'm saying that, I have to say the following sentence. These young people, Zuckerman, Sivia Lubetkin, Chavka Folman, when the war broke out, like all the other leaders of the Polish Jews, they escaped towards the east side of Europe, towards the Russian front. All of the leaders of the Polish Jews from the first rank between the wars escaped Poland. The only leadership, first rank, between the two wars that came back, that stopped at some point when they escaped to the east and said, what have we done? We are the leaders of the youngsters of Poland during the two world wars. We are the leaders of the youth movement. What have we done? We left our children there and we escaped and we left them without their leaders between these two wars. And they made a first leadership decision. They turned their back. They turned their back on their dream to immigrate to Palestine and to eventually find themselves in Palestine. And they came back to Warsaw under the German occupation. They were the only leadership from the first rank to be there with the Jews or young Jews during Second World War. And at the Eichmann trial, Gideon Hausner, who was a prosecutor, asked Sivia when she testified, what did you do when you came back to Warsaw with the youngsters? Now, I want to read you her answer. This has nothing to do with the uprising. She said the following. The Jewish youth movements adjusted. I want you to think what word lies behind this text. One word. What did they actually do? The Jewish youth movement adjusted their works to the new reality. Right from the beginning, when it appeared to us that the German policy was to degrade us, to change us into a nation of slaves, ignorant people lacking culture, we still believed that this was not total destruction. If we thought that these prohibitive laws were intended to wipe up the human image, then our battle was to preserve the human image, to develop a spirit of revolt against these evil decrees. And when I say revolt, I do not refer at present to a particular rebellion, but rather to preserve the human, social, and cultural character of the youth. Remember, interpretation of situation and all these stages of leadership. Their interpretation of the situation was that actually what they want is to humiliate us, to make us a riffraff. And if so, what is the actions we should take? One word, education. What they did when they came back was all aspects of education. They built up libraries, and when I will not go into more details. When is it that you invest in education? You invest in education when you think there is a future. Education is always about the future. So what Sivia tells us here, that we came back and we only wanted to preserve the human nature, the human dignity, the Tselem Elohim of the youngsters that were about to be nihilistic. Later in her testimony, she describes where did they stop the education. What is this moment in the evolution, in the process that made them stop using education? And this moment happened in the autumn of 1941, when one of the emissaries, by the way, a boy, by the name of Henek, came to Warsaw from Vilna. Now you have to know that Yitzhak Zuckerman is from Vilna. Vilna, between the wars, was part of Poland. And he came to the ghetto, and first of all, he told Yitzhak Zuckerman that all his family was murdered in Ponar. And the second thing he did, he told them that in Vilna, Jews are murdered by the thousands every day in Ponar. I don't know if any of you were ever visiting Ponar. It's one of the most shattering places on earth. They killed there about 100,000 Jews. In Vilna, the Jews, actually the Germans, came in 1941 while invading Russia. And immediately upon arrival, the Vilna Jews did not have 2 years of life. Immediately when the Germans came in September of 1941, they started to kill the Jews. And immediately in Vilna, there was an underground. Because the issue is the killing of the Jews and not the German occupation. So when Henek told them about what happened in Vilna, they suddenly, in an unbelievable insight, understood that actually the aim of the war is a kind of a total destruction of the Jewish people. I can understand this only. How would they imagine such a thing? How does anybody get to such an insight, such an unexpected insight? I attribute it to two things. First, to their very early age. They were very young, and when you are young, you're much more flexible to change your thoughts. And the second, most of them did not have families, so they didn't have this deep involvement and the responsibility to children and grandchildren, so they could really be wild with their thinking. Just let me tell you that Mordechai Levich, when the revolt broke out, Mordechai Levich was the commander of the Jewish fighting organization. He was 18. They were all really so very young. Yitzhak Zuckerman, the old one, was 22. So when you think of these ages and when you think what they did and how they understood and how they reacted, you stand breathless. So, in the words of Sivia, on the same day, we heard Henek's testimony. This was a decisive moment in the life of the Jewish underground movement. We stopped our social activities and educational activities, and all our efforts were now devoted to active self-defense. They stopped believing in the future. I just a picture of Tzivia, and I will go on. The timing. I made some chapters. The timing of the uprising is really amazing and very symbolic. The uprising took place on the eve of Pesach, as you know, Passover night. The Seder, they went to the rabbi to ask him for permission, and the rabbi said it's okay. The holiday that we refer to as Chag HaChirut, the holiday of Chirut is freedom. It's much more than freedom. It's breaking the chains of slavery. And Chag HaAviv, it's the holiday of spring, and it's considered in the tradition the new year. I won't go why Rosh Hashanah eventually won, but Pesach is also the new year, and the birth cradle of the Jewish people is the Exodus from Egypt. So this is a very symbolic time, and now we will go to some of the myths connected with the uprising. We will go back to the uprising in a second. When the word came out that there was an uprising at the Warsaw Ghetto, some of the leaders of Eretz Israel, of the Yishuv, like Golda Meir, related to what happened. And by the way, The notion and the rumor was that Sylvia Lubetkin died in the uprising, and she became a kind of an idol. Sometimes with the Jewish people, you have to die to become a goddess. And so said Golda in May of 1943. Our rebellious friends in the diaspora, who prefer heroic death over surrender and muted death, do it to preserve the dignity of the Jews for the coming generations. This is one of the myths, that it was done for one reason, to save the honor of the Jewish people. In a minute, I will contradict this myth, but by the way, not every myth is fake news. Sometimes myth is real reality. And this too, we will see in a minute. So, what said Yitzhak Sadeh? Yitzhak Sadeh was the commander of the Palmach, the fighting force of the Haganah. The fighting in the ghetto was the most powerful negation of the diaspora. You could see here all the elements of Zionism in the Palestinian diaspora. That means Zionism actually was contradicting the Golah, the life in the diaspora. And of course, what they did in Warsaw Ghetto is they saved the Jewish people. Actually, in a minute, you will see to what it was compared. It was compared in Yediot Achronot. I'll give you only one example. Yediot Achronot on 16 May in 1943 published the information. You can see the paper, but I don't know how many of you read Hebrew. The Nazis have really burned out the ghetto and the remains, and there is no more ghetto, Warsaw Ghetto. Warsaw's Metzada. You know the story of Metzada? Metzada fell, the Nazis set fire, burning all that was left of the ghetto. Now, the comparison to Metzada is really a completely misunderstanding. What happened in Metzada? Exactly. In Metzada, those who were staying there against the Romans committed suicide, a collective suicide. This is not what the rebels or the fighters of the ghetto fighters meant. No suicide was in their mind. So what was it, the ghetto fighting? What was the uprising? Not a suicide. The Yishuv, of course, liked the word uprising, and I want to give you the difference between uprising and fighting. Uprising is actually rebellious. The Zionism element, one of the main Zionism elements that comprises Zionism is the rebel against the diaspora life, the diaspora heritage, and they used all the time the word rebellion. Now, I will tell you in a second something about the name of the kibbutz. Fighting is what soldiers do, and soldiers are free. They are emissaries of their countries. Fighting is the word that the uprising committers preferred to use when they meant to speak about the uprising of the ghetto Warsaw. Now, the Yishuv, when they asked to be called Kibbutz Lochamei HaGetaot, the Yishuv didn't like the name of the kibbutz for two reasons. First of all, because the word ghetto is not in Hebrew. And at that time, Hebrew was highlighted. You should speak Hebrew. You should change your family name into a Hebrew name. So once they accepted, okay, we shall leave the word ghetto, but we shall call it Mordei HaGetaot. Mordei HaGetaot, the rebellions of the ghetto. They would not agree. And these were people, when they decided something, nobody could stand in their way. So eventually, it ended up in the fighting, the ghetto fighters, kibbutz and museum. Many Israelis until today call the kibbutz Mordei HaGetaot, the ghetto rebellion kibbutz, which is, of course, a remnant of old thinking. So, I will go on, and I will, once we understand what's the difference between fighting and uprising, I will go to this, to reality. No, I missed something. Yeah. Mythology is not necessarily fake news. What is the grandeur of the uprising? First of all, it's the sizes. Little David, very little David, against Goliath. The German army against 800 fighters in the ghetto. The second, and that must be remembered, it was the first urban uprising in all of occupied Germany, Europe. When you speak about what's the name of the French, about the Maquis in French, everybody, first of all, in France was in the Maquis, and Maquis came after the uprising of the ghetto fighters. The Polish uprising, that was only by the end of 1944. This was actually, and truly, in reality, the first urban uprising in all of German occupied Europe, and they did it with 50 pistols. So we have to understand, once we compare the Jewish conduct in Second World War to other nations, suddenly the whole grandeur of the story comes out. And this happened, by the way, at the Eichmann trial. Fighting for one line in history books, probably true, but not all the story, and fighting for Jewish history and Jewish dignity. The Jewish dignity is something, again, when the time aiming and the time you mean is the future. So we go to the reality. I am going to read to you something unbelievable now. Everybody knows who Abba Kovner was? Okay. Abba Kovner was the head of the underground at the Vilna Ghetto, from which Hennek came. You will see here something unbelievable. He was very young at that time, and he became the head of the uprising. And I want you to see how he analyzes the situation and what he says they were not part of the discussions in the German SS. What he says here explains to you exactly what was the uprising. It's a protocol of a meeting in 1941. And Abba said, all the events so far mean ponari, death. Even if this fact is not the whole truth, because the whole truth is far deeper and greater. The annihilation of thousands is just the tiding of the extermination of millions. Ponari is not an episode. It's a well-calculated system which so far is not clear to us. Can you imagine? This is profit. Can we escape? Options. He's considering the options. I don't have such protocols to the Warsaw Ghetto, but I know it's very close to this. No, it's a consistent system. Escaping from one place to another is an illusion. There is no haven in the escape. Is there any possibility of rescue? The answer, although cruel, no. There is no rescue. Our answer should be even more outspoken. Maybe there is some rescue to individuals, but to other people, to the millions of Jews under Nazi occupation, there is no rescue. Listen, this is September of 1941. Is there an outlet? Yes. Uprising and armed resistance. The unclear issue in the debate is how do we draw the certainty that we are facing a total physical extermination. He uses these words. Even if it's clearly obvious to me, I cannot convince the others. A full conviction could be reached only with the last remnant to live. I will shorten this and I will go to the end. Some here asked, how can we resist when we deal with dramatically and tragically uneven forces? But the deed cannot be conditioned by the reply to this question. The main thing is, how can we not defend ourselves? The action we are going to take is not an act of despair. It's not the end of the story. Objectively speaking, it might be the end, but we are asked to make the total choice. Now, listen to the last sentence. A huge light will befall us when into this bleeding darkness a new notion will penetrate, that we are the masters of death. Then and only then our lives will have a morning. Here you get the first notion of what this event was. Actually, we cannot do anything against the decision to kill us all. What we can do is to master our death, to choose how we die and to choose to die resistant. So it's not a question of dignity, it's a question of control. How much do we have control over our fate? And these young people, that's what they did. They took control of the way they died. And they insist that they were fighters and not rebels. I always prepare twice. There is a mythological letter. You know that Antek Zuckerman during the uprising was not in the ghetto. He was in the Aryan side of Warsaw. He was trying to collect weapons to help. And he got a letter from Mordechai Nilevich, who was in the ghetto, of course, because he was the commander. This letter was rewritten from the memory, but I would like to read to you the last sentence of what Mordechai Nilevich said and the first sentence. Dear Yitzhak, it's April 23rd, 1943. I think the common notion is that the rebel took and lasted for about 10 days. But we know from evidence that we get lately that they were also fighting in the ghetto in September of 1943. So there were remnants of fighters still going on like 7 months after it started. It is impossible to put into words what we have been through. Sorry. One thing is clear, what happened exceeded our boldest dreams. The Germans ran twice from the ghetto. One of our companies held out for 40 minutes and another for more than 6 hours. The mindset is in the brush makers area exploded, etc., etc. And let's go to the end. Peace go with you, my friend. Perhaps we may still meet again. The dream of my life has risen to become a fact. Self-defense in the ghetto will have been a reality. Jewish armed resistance and revenge are facts. I have been a witness to the magnificent heroic fighting of Jewish men in battle. Mordechai Nilevich, Ghetto, April 23rd, 1943. What is the heritage of the ghetto fighters? First of all, I want to give you some pictures to show you the heritage. Iconic pictures. Why doesn't it move? These were pictures that were taken, very rare pictures that were taken from the end of the uprising. Naturally, most pictures that we have about the Jews in Shoah were taken by German people. Recently, 2 weeks ago, we got to know that there was somebody who was called to the ghetto to depress the fire that was burning in the ghetto. And he took some pictures, and he was a Polish guy who took pictures, and it will be represented in the Washington Holocaust Museum, I think, in the next month, some of the pictures that he took. His son gave it. But you can see here, first of all, I think that on the left picture, you can see the boy, which we see, and is the big icon of the Warsaw Uprising, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. You remember the boy? of course, it's an iconic picture. Who is usually ordered to raise his hands when defeat? Soldiers who have weapons. They are defeated by and the army who defeated them tell them to take their hands up. The boy became an icon of the Shoah, and this is one heritage of the actual crime that the Germans did when they took children into the battle and into extermination. The second picture, I put this picture on a larger size so you can see it more clear. I don't know, and I cannot read the face of the boy. I'm not sure that's fear. It's like maybe shock, but it doesn't matter. A small boy with his hands up like a soldier is the iconic picture of the ghetto. It was the fight of all the ghetto, and that's the heritage, and not only the fighters. This is just another picture of the evacuation of the ghetto, and I'm going further. The heritage was also very strong on the fighters in the War of Independence of the State of Israel. This is a proclamation by Palmach Elad Peled, the commander of the Palmach, when they took Safed in 1948. The Jewish flag, which was dropped at the battling ghetto, will be raised again on the Safed fortress. The heritage is that actually the War of Independence is the continuation of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which is a whole new concept in the negation of the Gola and the diaspora. Actually, the diaspora gave us the inspiration and the strength to fight in the War of Independence. We shall hold Safed, the capital of the Galilee. You, the fighters, be strong and brave. Let the heroes of the ghetto be a symbol and a cornerstone in Israel's march to its freedom. Right after the war, Yitzhak Zuckerman wrote, on the first encounter with the leaders of the Yishuv in London in 1945, in August, he wrote a telegram to Palestine, and he already had in mind how to commemorate the ghetto uprising. You can see this, can you see clearly what is written there? You can see ghetto fighters, new kibbutzim to memory ghetto fighters. Stop. That was the part of the telegram. That is in 1945. He didn't even consider at that time to come to Israel, to Palestine, because he was responsible of those who survived and organizing them. But he already thought of a kibbutz to memorize and commemorate the Warsaw Ghetto. So that was in his mind always. By the way, he did one more thing. On the day the war ended, he put a small metal coin in the Warsaw Center, which put only one letter from the Jewish alphabet. It's the B, Bet, Ot Bet, Bereshit, yes. Bereshit bara Elohim. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was also left a heritage of a kind of a controversy about commemoration in Israel of the Shoah. This is a discussion in the Knesset in 1961 about the changing name of the Holocaust Day. And Emma Talmi said, how can the Knesset explain the change in the name of this day by omitting the national event of the uprising? They wanted to call it only Yom HaShoah, and not Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, the Shoah and the Bravery Day. Other nations, like the Poles, picked sparks from the burning ghetto and made her a torch. It was one of the cornerstones of our War of Independence. The ghetto uprising educates our youth to see the diaspora Jews in an accurate perspective. Only when we tie together the Holocaust heroism and the uprising, our education is complete. And then came Mordechai Nurok, who lost his wife and 2 children at Riga. The cute 4 years old the cute 4-year-old boy hiding with his parents, knowing he has to keep silence, not to ask for water, was also a little hero, but not a ghetto fighter. One must protect the core of this day and rescind the name that leaves the Shoah only once heard. This contradicts the fact of millions of martyrs and maybe tens of thousands of fighters, the proportion between Shoah and bravery. And I have to tell you that Yitzhak Zuckerman changed the terminology when he started to speak about Jewish resistance and not about the Jewish uprising. And resistance actually included all kinds of heroism during Second World War. Now the museum is also a part of the heritage. And I want to show you something amazing about this museum, which I think is symbolizing its whole spirit until today. When they opened the museum in 1949, or what was actually the beginning of the museum, on the day they established the kibbutz, they put a small note, which I put in the ellipse. This house is not a gravestone, but a warning. And they added, in the museum, we seek to educate the visitor to respect the victims of the Holocaust and not pity them, not to be ashamed of them, but to honor them. And the very important meaning of that lies in this. This is actually the heart of what I wanted to tell you. The story of the resistance was mostly about turning the victim into a hero. The struggle was against viewing the victim as an object lacking the ability to react and act. A war against the dehumanization of the victim, the refusal to accept the dehumanization stemming from the image of passive victim. The transition from victim to hero is made possible through creating the option of active resistance and its realization. The uprising is not a mere reaction to evil, but a set of human values defying it. The last sentence is, if you want, the heart of what I wanted to tell you, but I'm not finished yet. In the kibbutz, there is a second generation. They went to war in what for them is the harshest war Israel ever went through, and that's the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Most of them had to fight at that war, and they took the Shoah with them to the war, which actually was almost the destruction of the third temple, of the second temple, as Moshe Dayan used to say that. Tzvika Vered was a pilot in the kibbutz who fell to the hands of, was captured by the Syrians. And he said the following when he came back: if I survived my days in the Syrian captivity, it was just an outcome of the stories I was raised on as son of Holocaust survivors. It was easier to everyone like me who heard about the Holocaust the way I did. The tortures we went through was nothing compared to what they've been experiencing. In addition to my full confidence that eventually I will return home, and I forgot one sentence is, and I, in controversy to my parents, had a home to go back. I never end up, and I also want to screen to you a small film, but I never end any of my lectures without a part of what is the manifesto of the survivors of the Holocaust. In 2002, it was the last international gathering of survivors of the Holocaust internationally. It was in Yad Vashem. And at the end of the convention, which was the last, because in 2002, most survivors were already too old to make these long trips, they published our manifesto to the next generations. It's a magnificent, moral, amazing document, and I will give you only the last part of it. And it goes with the new set of values which was meant by the ghetto, Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The memory of the Shoah is continuous and dark, exposing the ugly and naked face of consummate inhumanity that threatens the very nature and stature of civilization itself. We who struggled through the valley of death only to see how our families, communities, people were destroyed, did not descend into despondency and despair. Rather, we struggled to extract a message of meaning and renewed purpose for our people and for all people, namely a message of humanity, of human decency, and of human dignity. Just one word, more than 100,000 survivors signed this document. The Holocaust, which established the standard for absolute evil, is the universal heritage of all civilized people. The lessons of the Holocaust must form the cultural code for education towards human values, democracy, human rights, tolerance, and patience, and opposition to racism and totalitarian ideologies. From Har HaZikaron in Jerusalem, the words of Rabbi Hillel need to ring out loud and clear. What is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow human being. This is our heritage for the next generations. This is what the ghetto fighters wanted to do for the futures when they defied evil, but they were not committing suicide, and they were not only for one sentence in the history. Now, I want to show you a film, a small 6 minutes. איפה זה? אולי שזה עבר מאצלך, זה נמחק? הנה, השני, 39. Okay. You will see here pictures from the uprising and also a human message. זה פה. צריך זה על גדול? מסך מלא? זה מסך מלא? I'm sorry.
Sorry, finding it in a minute.
Okay, זה גדול ישר. Here it is, אנחנו בגדולים, נכון? אוקיי, גדול.
אחרי שנגלה כל האסון, הייתי נמשך כמו לאבן שואבת, לגטו ההרוס, ויושב שעות על האבנים. פתאום אחרי הרעש הגדול הזה, אחרי האימה הגדולה, שקט.
הייתה ישיבה במרכז דרור, בקומונה. השיחה הייתה על הנושא, מה תפקידנו בארץ, מה עלינו לעשות אחרי העלייה. כל אחד ביטא את רחשי ליבו, וקודם כל, כאילו יאשימו את עצמם. למה אני נשארתי בחיים? למה חברים שלי שהיו איתי נספו? מדוע מגיע לי לחיות ולהם להיות שכנה יפה? והסיכום היה של השיחה, שאין לנו כל רשות לנסות לשקם את חיינו הפרטיים ולדאוג לעצמנו. אנחנו בזה שנשארנו בחיים, חבים אנו חוב למתים, ועלינו לעשות לזכרם.
אנחנו עוד בחוץ לארץ החלטנו, ובמקום אנדרטה או משהו כזה, אנחנו נקים בית ואנשים שמצאו ברעיון הזה שזה משהו גדול, אז הצטרפו, ואנחנו התמונו את המשק הזה.
קיבוץ לוחמי הגטאות הוקם ב-19 באפריל 1949, זה יום המרד.
The same year the kibbutz was founded, the cornerstone for the museum was laid. The Ghetto Fighters' House is the first Holocaust museum in the world, and the first to be established by survivors and former members of the underground ghetto resistance groups and partisan units. The museum offers a rich variety of educational activities, including a center for humanist education and an educational center named after Tzviya and Yitzhak Zuckerman, among the leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The Ghetto Fighters' House focuses on people and highlights the Jewish resistance movements, the greatest and most important of which is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising.
אנחנו נמצאים בכניסה לתערוכת גטו ורשה, במקום שנקרא בית לוחמי הגטאות. זה אחד מהמקומות היותר חשובים והיותר קרובים ללב. יש בפולין בסך הכל, לפני המלחמה, כ3.5 מיליון יהודים, למעלה מ3 מיליון מהם הושמדו. תסתכלו רגע על התמונה הזאת, תסתכלו על החיילים מאחוריו. הנשק? מה הם אומרים לילד ההוא? תרים ידיים. למי אומרים להרים ידיים? חייל אחר. אויב. לאויב. זה אחרי המרד.
קרבו קודם הטנקים, וראינו את הגרמנים שצעדו באמצע הכביש, בטוחים.
התחלנו לראות ולזרוק עליהם בקבוקי מולוטוב ורימונים.
נפל דבר שהוא למעלה מחלומותינו הנועזים ביותר. הגרמנים ברחו פעמיים מן הגטו.
The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is the heroic story of young Jews who, although the Germans did everything in their power to break them physically and psychologically and drag them to the lowest place a human can be, in that hellhole, they found the strength to fight back. Although it was a battle that could not be won, it was a great triumph for the human spirit.
ב-47, כשיצאתי מפולין, אז חילקנו את הכרטסת כדי להוציא את הארכיון מפולין. אז כל אחד קיבל שליש. אבל לפני שאמרנו לעלות לעלייה, במרסל, פגשו אותנו, אנשי הגנה, ודרשו למסור את כל המסמכים, כי יהיו חיפושים של המורשת הבריטית. ומסרתי את הכרטסת. אני קשרתי אותה על גופי, מתחת לכותרת שלי.
The survivors brought photographs and documents from their hiding places, so they could tell the story that the human lexicon hasn't enough words to describe. They finally unloaded these testimonies, physically and emotionally, on the soil of their kibbutz, and left us, the future generations, the moral obligation to continue to preserve and tell their story.
אז בבית הקטן הזה התחילו לאסוף דברים שהיו ספרים, תמונות, דוקומנטים.
זה השיר על עם היהודי שנהרג. המסמך המקורי.
זה קופל ונכנס כאן.
קופל ונכנס כאן, והיא באה עם המזוודה הזאת, והעבירה את זה לבני משפחתו בשפעים.
אני אמנם יושבת פה בתור הדור השלישי, אבל המחשבות שלי בימים אלה בתור אימא לילדים, זה דווקא על הדור הרביעי, שלא יזכה להכיר את הסבא וסבתא אפילו שהיו שמה, ואיך מנחילים את הזיכרון ומשמרים אותו.
האנשים ידעו לאן לוקחים אותם ברכבת?
לא, הם לא ידעו, הם אמרו להם שאנחנו לוקחים.
אנחנו הולכים, ובעצם לאן באמת הרכבות נסעו?
להרוג אותם.
Vous voyez, c'est comme si on était à l'intérieur et qu'on voyait par les fenêtres ce qui se passe dehors.
Yad LaYeled is a separate wing housed in a round building which leads underground in an attempt to recreate the impossible life of the children of the ghetto, illustrating the true stories of the lives they led. Balancing this painful experience are well-lit art rooms where children can internalize and deal with the experience and even come away with a sense of empowerment. on the same stairway next to the historic aqueduct, in the very place where the survivors held their first memorial assembly, the tradition is carried on, and it is held every year by their successors.
כמפקדו של צבא ההגנה לישראל, כבן הדור השני לשואה וכבן הדור השני לתקומה, אני מתחייב, נמשיך ונבטיח את שרשרת הנצח של העם היהודי בארצו.
וליד אבא שלי וסבתא שלי היה בית שימוש ציבורי קטן, צבוע בירוק. וסבתא דחפה את אבא לתוך בית השימוש, סגרה את הדלת מאחוריהם, והשיירה עזבה בלעדיהם. ו10 דקות אחר כך, מ-600 האנשים בשיירה הזאת, 598 היו מתים מתחת לקרח של הדנובה, והמון שנים אחר כך, הוא אמר לי, אירי, פה נולדה הציונות שלי. פה אני הבנתי שאני מוכרח שתמיד יהיה לי מקום ללכת אליו. וכדי שיהיה לי תמיד מקום ללכת אליו, אז צריכה תמיד להתקיים מדינת ישראל.
And I would like to finish with something personal, if I may, which goes with everything that we've been saying. In my family, the highest esteemed thing is education. And because, as they say, they can take your money, they can take everything from you, but they cannot take what you've learned. When and of course, it was going without saying that I finished the army and I go to the university and I finish the first degree and the second and I do my PhD and no escape from this fate. And when I came to write my PhD, my father called me for a conversation and he told me, which I didn't understand at that time, but I understood when I came 23 years ago to Lochamei Getaot. He told me, I wish you would write the story of the survivors of the Holocaust in Israel, who immigrated to Palestine and Israel. And it wasn't like in the medieval era. It was at the 1980s. There was not one research about the survivors of the Holocaust who immigrated to Palestine, when in the first decade of Israel, one of every third Israeli was a survivor. And only later, it was burning in him. And I did this, and I became the pioneer of the research of survivors of the Holocaust in Israel, and in the day after. And only later when I came to Lochamei Getaot, and I met personally Chavka and Dorka, and all this generation of unbelievable human beings, I understood what was actually my father telling me as the subtext. The subtext is, please tell us in the right light. And the right light is that we are not miskenim, we are not miserable, we are not scarred. We actually won, and we built this country, and we are victors. And this is actually what the uprising was all about. I thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions? After this, we should take a deep breath and see if we can have a question. Yes.
Thank you
Thank you. It was fascinating. I learned a lot.
Try to be short. First of all, as I know, I'm from Yugoslavia, and I know a little bit about, of course, Poland is not far from us, but I don't, as I learned in history, you know, Polish Jews were not escaping to Russia at the beginning of the war because Stalin and Hitler made a peace before they actually started the war. So Poland was divided in two parts, and the eastern part of Poland became part of Russia. Our own Rabbi Marmor survived, and so many Jewish people were happy to be in Siberia instead of Nazi camp. But your story is true that some of these Polish fighters came back, Jewish people came back to Poland to fight in Ghetto or whatever. I don't know whether you read Singer's novel, Certificate. Before the war started in Poland was such a big education and movement for Jewish especially young people, to move to Israel. So this education started much earlier, and unfortunately, because of the bureaucracy and politics which is involved everywhere today and in the past, they were not allowed to go to Palestine. It was so many sad stories. I mean, this book is like document what was happening. And you know, you are describing everything we know and we learn about our partisans. You know, a lot of Jewish people in Yugoslavia joined partisans, and we had uprising of this, and we have a lot of politicians together with Tito, who was Jewish origin, you know, fighting Germans too. I think in Poland, you mentioned it, was the biggest Jewish population in whole Europe. I know a little bit more Hungarian. There was a lot of assimilation.
I think I will answer you.
But Polish was biggest.
Between the invasion of Poland, I especially want to answer the first part of your remarks. In the first 3 months, 4 months actually, between the September 1st, 1939 until the end of December of 1939, the Jews were, the division between Russia and the Germany of Poland was actually only in the making, and there was a free passage to Russia. If there hasn't been, on the soil of Poland, when the war ended in 1945, there were about between 60 to 70,000 Jews, all in all, out of 3.5 million. Then came 200,000 people in the repatriation, and those were the Jews who escaped to Poland, from Poland to Russia. Between the first 4 months, these are the largest groups of those who were saved from the Polish Jews. Without them, actually, the Polish Jews would have been completely exterminated. Among them were emissaries from Palestine, from those who escaped, and of course, many young Jewish people. So the first 4 months was a huge escape into Russia. The Russians did not kill them. That's for a fact. Some were put to prison. Many of them were exiled to the Asian parts of Russia, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and all those. But there are about 200,000 Jews who escaped. Now, the second thing, the fact that I was speaking today about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which is a unique event, that the Jews served as partisans not only with Tito in Yugoslavia, but they were partisans in the Armia Ludowa, which was the socialist underground of the Polish. There were a few of them who succeeded not to be killed and infiltrated Armia Krajowa, that was the nationalist Polish underground, and they were actually the first underground, the Armée Juive in France, before the Maquis was established. So there is a huge part of fighting among the Jews during Second World War against the myth that they went to the death like slaughter to the like sheep to the slaughterhouse. But this is not the question I was raising today. But of course, there were fighters all over, and of course, there were fighters in the Red Army, Jewish fighters in the Red Army, and Jewish fighters in other arms, including the American Army. We know of many graves in the mass graves that was left in Europe that has Magen David in front of it. So the fighting story of the Jews is well known today, and it's a huge story, also by dimension.
Thank you for reminding about the Yugoslavia. One of my aunts, from my mother's side, not the foreman side, was actually a member of Tito's army. She was a nurse on the front lines, and she survived the war. She married a Yugoslav, and she has children there still. I mean, she's dead, but her children still live in Yugoslavia.
Better not to talk about politics.
Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight, for staying with us, for 1 hour of inspiration that turned into closer to 2 hours. Thank you, Professor Jablonka, for a wonderful talk. We invite you all to eat and also consider joining our Friends Association. We have here both email addresses of Rafi and myself. Please email us or contact Rafi today with interest, with a donation, with any way you would like to connect with us. Thank you so much. We're still here. If you have any questions, to Professor Jablonka, to me, to Rafi, thanks for coming, and thank you for everyone at home for being with us.
I just wanted to say thank you for that education, for that inspiration, and for a whole new concept for many of us as I moved around the room, and also for, I don't know your title, Ronit, but you did a marvelous job getting to Toronto and honoring us and teaching us. And of course, to our friend Ralph, what would we do without you? It was very emotional, but please don't leave without having some of the refreshments. And thank you very much for coming. And we have a lot of people on Zoom, so we have been many more. Thank you very much, but do join us.
Just a commercial pitch. I'm the president and the secretary and the treasurer of the Canadian Friends of the Ghetto Fighters House. And if for possible donations, the Canadian Friends is registered with the Canadian Revenue Agency, so I can provide tax-deductible receipts for any donations. And how to donate, you can come to me. I have instructions that I can give, either donation by e-transfer, or if you donate on the spot, I can give you a receipt right on the spot. Thank you.